Stories bigger than Texas, the Alamo podcast. Point at the Alamo. Most people would probably point to the famous church with the iconic arch. But really, the Alamo was a bustling 4.5-acre community anchored by its oldest building, the Long Barrack. Today we reveal the many lives of the Long Barrack, dating back nearly 300 years as missionary housing, evolving into a military outpost and hospital, then later the subject of fierce debate over historic preservation. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. We're joined today by Tom Castanos, the Alamo's Director of Interpretation, and Sherri Driscoll, the Alamo's former Senior Director of Interpretation. Thank you both for coming back on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
My pleasure.
I sometimes feel like the Long Barrack gets overlooked by visitors and by history, but it really has its own charm. Why is it something we should really stop and pay attention to?
It's possibly one of the oldest buildings west of the Mississippi. I mean, that's certainly a thing. But it really was the nerve center of both the Spanish mission and many parts of the compound for years and years afterwards.
And I think even its earliest days, there's an amazing amount of history there before the Shrine of Texas Liberty itself is actually built.
The Long Barrack, as you said, Tom, is the oldest building on the Alamo site, possibly one of the oldest structures in Texas. When was it built, and what was its original purpose?
Best estimates are 1724 that we're putting the stonework on this particular area.
300 years ago.
300 years ago. And it was the convent, or the convento, the home of the friars during the Spanish mission era. It would have looked considerably different than it does now. At one point, it would have had the beginnings of a second floor that were finished much later. But it was where these people lived and had their offices and were administering the day-to-day activities of a Spanish mission.
When we talk two stories, what is that in modern terms? Would it have been the same height as the Alamo Church? Would it have been above it?
It would have been a little bit above it.
I think so.
Yeah. Considering the church was never completed, it didn't get the bell tower structures that they intended to have. So at that point in time, the church might have been a little bit taller. But as the church stayed continuously in this state of construction, it would have been the tallest building on the property.
After the Spanish mission became secularized in 1793, how did the Long Barrack evolve into a military outpost?
There was space, and troops needed space. And it provided buildings and structures that they needed, and so that's what it was used for. The old Long Barrack, or what back then would have been known as the convento, became a fine barracks for soldiers. And of course, we know that during the Battle of the Alamo itself, it saw a lot of action as the men who defended the Alamo used those walls to try to live as long as they could and to fight as long as they could.
When did the hospital open?
Early 1800s is what we feel is the date for the opening of the hospital. You know, it was always sort of a building that was used for multiple reasons, multiple purposes, and at that moment in history, that's what they needed, and that's what was installed there.
Was it the first hospital in Texas?
As far as we know, yes, that is the truth, that patients were seen there earlier than any other place in Texas.
There's going to be a recurring theme that we're going to hear throughout this history. I think we tend to think of recycling as a new thing, and it's not. It's by far, it's not. And whereas it may not have been, to save the planet, it was to save money. If you had a building that had 3 good walls, you just added a 4th and a roof and moved in. So what was a good convent became a good barrack, and a good barrack became a good hospital, on down through a fortress and a grocery store. I don't want to foreshadow what we're getting into, but we're going to see the same thing that happens in downtown areas all around the world, even to this day, where the warehouse district turns into a shopping center, which turns into apartments later on. This building has had so many lives.
Sherri, you mentioned that during the 1836 Battle of the Alamo, the Long Barrack was the site of heavy hand-to-hand fighting. What went on in there?
Well, what we know is that it was probably the most fortified position that they had. Once Mexican troops were able to cross the walls, the outer walls of the Alamo defenders fell back inside, some inside the old church, but many inside the Long Barrack, hoping that they could hold out just as long as they possibly could, hoping that help would arrive. Of course, that never happened, and so they simply fired as much powder as they possibly could, trying to stave off the Mexican troops that were attempting to enter the building, and they held out just as long as they possibly could. It wasn't very long, unfortunately, and that was just a numbers game. There were not enough defenders to hold them at bay.
As a matter of fact, hand-to-hand fighting is very, very rare historically, except for the Long Barrack. Again, as Sherri talked about, as this last stand of a last stand. If its claim to fame is one of the oldest buildings in Texas, another claim to fame is it's one of those rare places, sadly, where that kind of combat actually took place.
By 1845, when Texas becomes part of the United States, the Long Barrack has been through a lot. It's now in the hands of the U.S. Army. What changes did the Army make?
So the Long Barrack, they're gonna use it as a barrack once again. And they'll also continue to use the hospital at that point in time. So probably its appearance is going to change. It's going to be a little more formalized just because of the very nature of military buildings. But in a strange sort of way, the usage of it doesn't change.
The U.S. Army installed a gable roof. They added outside stairwells to the upper floor, like you said, kind of formalizing the building a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And they're going to make it as useful as they can, and again, as functional as they can. Of course, they're doing the same thing to the church at the same time. They're making it a warehouse. It gets the peaked roof. It finally gets the historic facade.
The iconic arch.
Yeah, absolutely. That most people, and you see artist renderings, thought have been there all the time, which really was not there till much, much later. It's going to be a hub of all of the activity for the westward expansion of the United States. Everything would have been stored through here: gunpowder, weapons, foodstuffs, wagon supplies, one-stop shopping for all points west.
The Army stays at the Alamo for 30 years and then moves to nearby Fort Sam Houston. At that point, we see commercialization creep into the Alamo district.
So the buildings weren't being used, and businessmen saw an opportunity. And so it became a store, dry goods store, operated by two different men over the years. It served its purpose, but both men and their businesses made changes to the building. And so you see what the men fought in 1836 certainly didn't look anything like the stores that were operated later in that century. I think that you'll see that they really liked the idea of having their store in this very historic structure, but they needed to change it to suit their needs.
They had ads on the outside.
They did.
That's
all kinds of billboards.
interesting to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And can you imagine, this is going to lead into another part of the history, but the descendants of those men who fought at the Battle of the Alamo, their families, can you see that they're maybe having a hard time with this element of commerce going on where their ancestors' blood, poured out?
Yeah.
There was a little bit of, hard feelings about that, and that's going to take us forward into an era when we are going to stop and remember the Battle of the Alamo and the men who fought it.
Right, because we're just at this point 1 generation out from the battle. Mm-hmm. What kinds of items were sold in these general stores?
Everything from flour to nails,
yeah,
reins for horses, anything you could imagine, because it's a one-stop shop.
Yep.
There's not, you don't go to H-E-B to go get your groceries and go down to Walmart to pick up your toilet paper.
Right.
There's everything you need right there. If it's for sale in that Long Barrack.
We start seeing this area become a bustling commercial center, which means the Long Barrack kind of paves the way for a more modern downtown San Antonio.
That's right. And again, once again, this building that was already 110 plus years old by the time of the battle is still being reconditioned into grocery stores and all of these other things. I mean, I think it's a testament to the people who originally built the foundations that it was around this long after all the things it had been through.
That's
to
a
be
good
available
point.
for
They
that.
probably never imagined the
Right.
future of this building. They built it as a convento.
Remember,
Absolutely.
These people built it as a monument, and as a monument to their belief systems, and it also represented them, the work that was put into it. Today most things are built for profit, which means that corners get cut and you buy the cheapest materials to make the building more profitable. This is a representation of the people who built it, and they wanted it to be here forever. And they got a good record so far.
As you've alluded, a different kind of battle starts brewing between commerce and preservation. A school teacher named Adina de Zavala starts working to preserve the Long Barrack.
Adina was a preservationist. She was related to the people that took part in the events of the earlier 1800s. She had a great pride in that history and wanted to make sure that it was preserved. And what she saw happening at the Long Barrack was a disregard or disrespect for the history that had happened within those walls. And so she tried everything she could to get people's attention and say, this is inappropriate. One of the people that she attracted was Claire Driscoll, a very wealthy woman who also was descended from individuals that were taking part in the Texas Revolution. And so together, they went and eventually purchased the Long Barrack. Now, they didn't always see eye to eye. And quite frankly, it was Adina who was the preservationist. She was the one who had studied the building and knew what its history was. And she's the one that wanted to make sure that it would stand as close to the original look as it possibly could. Clara had different ideas. Eventually, she would make the decision to remove the second floor of the Long Barrack, which she did not believe was original to the building. She was wrong, but she believed that, and so she had a crew go in there and take it down. And we end up with a one-story Long Barrack.
The research today is different. We have more information than they had.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's so important, and it just drives me up a wall when someone says, well, that's just revisionist history. All history should be revisionist history. We learn new things. Just because it's something that happened a long time ago doesn't mean that the knowledge that we have of it is stagnant. We don't have, there's not a finite amount of knowledge, and these new things come to us. We have to be willing to look at facts and adjust our stories accordingly. Not always easy to do. We get kind of set in our ways, but it's a great testament. The other thing I think about is the fact that today, looking backwards, hindsight being 2020, it's hard to imagine that they didn't immediately consider the place this, place of memorial and all of that it went through all these gyrations of grocery stores and all of these things. But I think it really speaks to the practicality of people of the time to continue to use a building beyond just leaving it unused as a memorial for the event that occurred there.
The major reconstruction work you mentioned happened between 1913 and 1916. A lot of changes to the Long Barrack, and a question we get a lot: what part of the structure is considered original?
The majority of the Long Barrack today is original. Yes, some walls have been changed slightly, but the footprint of that building stands today as it did in 1836.
And as far as fabric is concerned, I think it's my understanding that the west wall is still the most original fabric of all of the walls. And even that's been dramatically changed. Doors were removed, things like that would have originally faced into the original mission compound. But just percentage of natural fabric, it's going to be the west wall is going to be the most original of the building.
The wall that faces modern-day Alamo Plaza.
Correct.
So when you're walking through Alamo Plaza and you're walking that path from the Long Barrack and you come around the corner and you see the Alamo Church, that's the part that you were talking about.
The part facing the cenotaph.
Yes.
Yeah.
Today, the Long Barrack is a treasured historic relic. We've talked on this podcast about the archaeological work being done outside the Long Barrack. But what other measures are being taken to ensure it remains standing for future generations?
I think one of the most important things, and as both of us coming from the background of interpretation, is educating people how to take care of it. So, obviously I know you've had Pam and Tiffany talk about all of the nuts and bolts of preservation, but just helping our visitors understand that hand contact with the walls is very destructive, that this is the one and only. All of these things we've just talked about, all the oldest building, this terrible event of the battle itself, only remain standing with all of their help and their understanding of exactly how delicate this seemingly tough old stone building is. So I think education is the number one tool to preservation.
Yeah, we have a staff of interpreters and education staff that make sure that people get as much information as they possibly can about the building and the old church, the Shrine of Texas Liberty, because it is easy to look sort of at their age and their condition and think, oh, that's just an old building. They don't know the history behind it until they get in and get to talk to some of our interpreters and things like that. And so it's important that our staff is there to sort of be that first line of interpretation and make sure that they know what they're walking into, and that, yes, absolutely, this wall stood when James Bowie fought and died here.
And you think, oh, it's been here 300 years. I can't hurt it if I lean on it or if I touch it. But that's not the truth.
That's not the truth.
I can tell you, I'm not as sturdy as I was 20 years ago, right? And I'm nowhere close to 300 years old. These things don't improve with age. They're not wine. You know, there's moisture issues. There's just the wear and tear of time and wind and this ever so delicate weather that we have. You know, 140 degrees one day and 45 degrees the next. All of this is detrimental to the preservation of this stonework. So the more people know, the more they get involved at a deeper level and help us, the longer it's going to be around.
Going back to my original question, that it can sometimes be overlooked because the Alamo Church is so iconic. The charm behind it, I personally like the archways. I think they're beautiful. Having had this discussion now, what do you want people who come here to look at it and notice different that they might have before?
I think it's easy to overlook. Even I've been here 20 years, and I think it's not as eye-catching, flashy as the Shrine of Texas Liberty. You know, it has that famous hump on the top of it. It's got some windows, beautiful doors, that kind of thing. The Long Barrack is a little more plain. But what it makes up for in appearance, it makes up for in history. The actual events, the number of men that died within its walls, the fighting that took place as the sun was coming up on March 6, 1836, is what's important. This site is dedicated to the memory of those men, and that is the place I think that I have always been able to feel the closest to that event.
Yeah, I think it's identity, right? You know, we talk about the Alamo, and this is something we talk about all the time. People say, I want to go in the Alamo, and they point to the church. Well, if you're standing out in the plaza, you're in the Alamo, right? The walls that'll go through the future visitor center and they go through that would have gone through the post office. All of those were important parts of this battle. This is the last vestige of the original part of that we have, and it needs its place in the pantheon of things that we admire elevated.
Tom Castanos and Sherri Driscoll, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We've linked to pages on the Alamo's website with photos of what the Long Barrack looked like over the years, including a few essays written by former Alamo curator Dr. Bruce Winders. We've also linked to a short video you can watch about the history of the Long Barrack. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.